before the story begins, let me ask you something. If you've ever loved someone who never really chose you, if you've ever waited for a message that never came on time, if you've ever stayed quiet because you were afraid that speaking up would make them leave, then stay with me. And if this story feels like it's talking directly to your heart, subscribe to Once Upon a Heart, because these stories are not just told, they are felt. Some people don't lose love. They lose years. They lose sleep. They lose themselves. Not because the person left, but because the person stayed. Just enough to keep hope alive. This is not a loud love story. There are no grand gestures here. No dramatic fights. No villain you can easily hate. This is a story of a love that lived quietly and ended silently. We didn't fall in love the way movies show it. There was no moment where time stopped. No instant spark. It started with conversations. Small ones. A reply that came faster than expected. A laugh that felt natural. A comfort that didn't ask questions. You became part of my routine. Before I realized, you had become part of my heart. We talked about everything. Music, childhood memories, things we wanted to become. You listened in a way that made me feel seen. And I remember thinking, if someone understands me like this, how could this not turn into love? I didn't know then that understanding someone and choosing them are two very different things. You never said you loved me, but you stayed. And I mistook staying for commitment. You called when you needed comfort, texted when the world felt heavy, disappeared when things felt light again. And I told myself stories to survive the silence. They're just busy. They're not good with emotions. They care, they just show it differently. I became very good at explaining your absence. I learned how to wait without complaining, how to love without asking, how to smile, even when I felt forgotten. And the scariest part? I didn't feel weak. I felt patient. Waiting became my language. Waiting for replies. Waiting for plans that stayed as maybe. Waiting for the day you would finally say what I had already felt for so long. I never wanted much. Just clarity. Just honesty. Just a place in your life. That wasn't temporary. But every time I got close to asking, fear would stop me, because deep down, I already knew the answer. And sometimes, not knowing feels safer than knowing the truth. If this sounds familiar, if you've ever been here, take a breath. You're not alone. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Once Upon a Heart. These stories are for people who love deeply and feel quietly. The moment didn't come dramatically. It came casually. You introduced me to someone new, and you said it without thinking. This is just a friend. That word stayed with me because I realized then that no matter how deeply I felt, no matter how long I waited, I had never been anything more in your story. I went home that night and cried silently, not because you hurt me, but because I finally stopped lying to myself. That night, I understood something painful. You didn't betray me. You were honest the whole time. I was the one who stayed, hoping silence would turn into love. And as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I asked myself a question. That changed everything. How long can someone wait before waiting becomes self-abandonment? Before we go on, if you're still here, it means this story is already sitting somewhere in your chest. Subscribe to Once Upon a Heart, because stories like this don't just pass through you, they stay. After that night, nothing really changed. And somehow, everything did. We still talked, still laughed, still shared moments that felt warm. But something inside me had shifted. I started hearing your words differently, seeing the pauses, noticing the effort I was making and the effort you weren't. And yet I stayed, because leaving someone you love is not a single decision. It's 100 small battles. You lose the hope. I became kinder to your absence than I was to my own pain. When you didn't call, I blamed your schedule. When you canceled plans, I blamed life. When you forgot important dates, I told myself love wasn't about keeping score. But late at night, when the world was quiet, And honesty had no place to hide. I felt it, the imbalance, the loneliness of loving alone. I was present in your life, in ways you were never present in mine. And still, I stayed. There was a moment, small but sharp. I needed you, not casually, not as a listener, but as someone who would show up. I reached out. I asked. I waited. And you didn't come. Not because you couldn't, but because you didn't think it mattered enough. That night, I sat with my phone in my hand, watching the screen go dark. And for the first time, I wondered if loving you was teaching me how to disappear. If you've ever felt invisible to someone who meant everything to you, leave a comment. Not for me, for yourself. Your story deserves a voice. There's something no one tells you about unbalanced love. It becomes familiar. The pain feels predictable. The disappointment feels normal. And normal feels safer than the fear of letting go. I knew how to survive loving you. What I didn't know was who I would be without you. So I stayed, not because I was happy, but because I was afraid of the silence that would come after. One day, someone asked me a simple question. Are you loved? Or are you just available? I laughed it off. But later, alone with my thoughts, that question kept echoing. Because availability looks a lot like love. When you're desperate to feel chosen, I realized I had been shrinking, lowering expectations, accepting crumbs, and calling them meals. And the hardest truth? You never asked me to do that. I did it because I wanted to be enough. Sometimes, the person breaking your heart is not the one you love. It's the version of yourself who keeps saying just a little longer. If this story feels heavy, it's because it's honest. And honesty is how healing begins. Subscribe to Once Upon a Heart, because in the next part, we reach the moment where love asks its most dangerous question. How much of yourself are you willing to lose to keep someone who is never yours? Let's continue. This is where the story stops being comfortable and starts becoming true, when love begins to ask for too much. If you're still here, it means this story has found a place inside you. Subscribe to this channel, because some stories don't entertain. They understand you. There comes a moment in every quiet love where you realize something terrifying. You are tired, not tired of loving, but tired of hoping. I started noticing how often I adjusted myself to fit into your life, how my needs waited patiently, while yours were answered immediately, how I celebrated your happiness, even when it came at the cost of my own. And I asked myself something I had avoided for years. If love requires me to keep hurting like this, why does it still feel like my responsibility to stay? Wanting more felt selfish. I told myself, at least they're kind. At least they're honest. At least they didn't leave. But love isn't supposed to feel like gratitude for emotional leftovers. I felt guilty for wanting consistency, effort, reassurance, as if asking to be chosen was asking for too much. And slowly, I learned how to silence my own needs before anyone else could. If you've ever felt guilty for wanting to be loved properly, this channel is for you. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. You're not asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person. It happened on an ordinary day. No argument. No goodbye speech. Just honesty, accidental honesty. You talked about your future. And for the first time, I wasn't in it. Not even as a possibility. You spoke freely, comfortably, without hesitation. And I realized something painful. I had been building a future with someone who never even opened the door. That's when it hit me. I wasn't losing you. I was losing the version of the story I had created in my head. People understand heartbreak when there's a breakup, but no one talks about the grief of walking away from something that never officially existed. There was no closure. No, we tried. No memories I could publicly mourn. Just a quiet ending that only I felt. And yet, the pain was real. Because loving someone deeply does not require permission. I stood in front of the mirror one night and barely recognized myself. I looked smaller, quieter, more careful. And I asked, when did loving someone start costing me my confidence? That was the night I stopped asking, why don't they choose me? And started asking, why am I choosing this? If you're still listening, it means this story has become personal. Subscribe to Once Upon a Heart, because sometimes healing begins the moment you realize you are not alone in how you feel. Leaving wasn't dramatic. I didn't wake up suddenly brave. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel free. I felt tired. Tired of explaining your absence. Tired of adjusting my expectations. Tired of loving in a way that kept asking me to be smaller. People think walking away feels like relief. It doesn't. It feels like grief mixed with doubt. Like cutting off a part of yourself and hoping you survive the bleeding. I didn't accuse you. I didn't demand answers. I simply stopped reaching. And that silence, that told me everything I needed to know. You didn't chase. You didn't ask why. You didn't notice the space growing between us. And that hurt more than any argument ever could, because it confirmed what my heart had been afraid to admit. I was holding on alone. If you've ever stopped texting, just to see if someone would notice, this channel is for you. Subscribe, like, and share. Your absence should be felt. Letting go didn't happen all at once. It happened in waves. I reached for my phone and remembered I shouldn't text. I saw something funny and remembered you weren't mine to tell anymore. My body had learned your presence before my mind learned your truth. And every day I had to relearn how to exist without waiting for you. No one talks about this part. When you walk away from unbalanced love, you don't feel immediately better. You feel empty because so much of your emotional energy had been poured into someone else that you forgot how to pour it back into yourself. There were nights where I questioned my decision. What if I was too sensitive? What if this was as good as love gets? But deep down, I knew peace shouldn't feel this painful to choose. One day, something small happened. I didn't wait for a message. I didn't check my phone repeatedly. I didn't feel anxious in the silence. And I realized I was breathing again, not fully healed, not completely okay, but no longer disappearing. I was choosing myself in quiet ways. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like love. Sometimes leaving isn't about strength. It's about honesty. If this part of the story feels heavy, it's because you're standing at the edge between who you were and who you're becoming. Like and comment. We explore what happens after the pain when love returns, not from another person, but from within. Is the bravest thing you can do is admit that love alone is not enough. If you've reached this part of the story, it's because you're closer to healing than you think. Subscribe, like, and comment. If you're still here, you didn't come to hear a story. You came because some part of this feels like your own life. Subscribe to this channel. This is a space for hearts that have loved deeply and are learning slowly how to heal. Healing didn't arrive with joy. It arrived with neutrality. Days where I didn't cry. Days where I didn't hope. Days where I simply existed. And that felt strange because pain had been my companion for so long. That peace felt unfamiliar. I started doing small things again, things that had nothing to do with you. Walking without checking my phone, laughing without wondering who I'd tell later, making plans that didn't depend on someone else's availability. I wasn't happy yet, but I was present, and that was new. One evening, I realized something quietly powerful. I hadn't thought about you all day, not because I forced myself not to, but because my life was slowly filling with other things. And in that moment, I understood healing isn't forgetting someone. It's remembering yourself. I didn't hate you. I didn't resent you. I simply stopped needing you to validate my worth. If you're healing slowly, if some days you're strong, and other days you miss what hurt you, stay. Like and comment, love. Healing is not linear, and you don't have to walk it alone. Loving you taught me many things. It taught me patience, but also the danger of too much tolerance. It taught me empathy, but also the cost of neglect of myself. Most importantly, it taught me this truth. Love should not feel like a performance, where you're constantly auditioning. To be chosen, love should be calm, reciprocal, safe, and if it isn't walking away is not failure. It's self-respect. I didn't need closure from you anymore, because closure came from understanding my own story. I loved sincerely. I stayed honestly. I left when I could no longer stay without breaking. That is not weakness. That is courage. And for the first time, I felt proud in my heart, not for how much it endured, but for how gently it learned to protect itself. If you are listening to this, while loving someone who keeps you in silence, if you are waiting for effort, clarity, or a sign that never comes, please hear this. You do not need to become smaller to be loved. You do not need to suffer quietly to be worthy, and you do not need to stay where your heart is slowly disappearing. One day, maybe not today, maybe not soon, but one day you will choose yourself. And when you do, love will no longer feel like waiting. Some love stories end, not with two people together, but with one person finally coming home to themselves. If this story touched your heart, if it felt like something you lived, or something you're still living, subscribe, like, and comment. Here we tell stories about love, loss, waiting, and healing, not to break you, but to remind you that your heart deserves more.